I'm really pleased to say we have Linda MacDonald, who's going to talk about why she signed the declaration. She's a global grassroots feminist activist standing for the human rights of women and girls who have been subjected to non-state torture. Together with Jeanne Sarson, she co-authored the book Women Unsilenced, Our Refusal to Let Torture Traffickers Win, recently released an audio version on Audible, and a French translation is coming soon. And then together with Jeanne Sarson, who will also be talking, works on violence against women and girls, a lifetime activist issue, is a lifetime activist issue. She's a writer, mother-loving, of twin sons, now men, grandparenting positions. She's a gardener. She's anchored by patriarchal misogyny, and Jeanne has a nursing background.
So I'm really thrown back to 3 years ago when Jeanne and I were writing the book, and Jeanne does most of the writing. So I was spending a lot of time on the internet, and that's when all of the trans issues were coming forward, and I was getting more angry and more angry and more angry. So 2.5 years ago, some of the NGOs started accusing any feminist who was pro-biology of women being sex beings, that we were anti-feminist. That was it for me. And I was hearing a lot about the drugging of children. And I'm a nurse, and the biology of giving children puberty blockers. I knew that it was wrong then, even before the science started talking about it more vocally. So I was up at 3 o'clock in the morning and found the declaration. I thought, holy, look at this. So I called Jeanne the next morning. I said, we have to sign this, have a look at it. If you're not going to sign it, I am. So that's how we started. And it wasn't long after that, we signed it as Persons Against Non-State Torture. We were contacted to come and speak, which was a thrill for us. And after that, we had our book published. We signed it in March the 7th of 2021, and our book was published in September. And so since that time, it's been an uphill battle. It was an uphill battle trying to get our book published, because even other feminists wouldn't publish our book, because we were talking about the United Nations. And I know that many feminists feel that the United Nations is totally against women, and I don't believe that. I know that there's much infiltration in the United Nations, but there are still good people there that are standing. And one of them, I believe, is the present Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Reem Al-Assam. She's been supportive of our work, and I'm one of those feminists that plans to stand and fight and try to rid as much patriarchy out of the United Nations as we can. And I feel the declaration is an important part of that. And also, as I mentioned, I was thinking about the children, but I was also, Article 8 is such an important article for us in the declaration, because it's all about violence against women. And really, it will not be accurate until we have the torture of women named in the declaration or anywhere in the full continuum. Most times you rarely hear women talk about us as women or girls being tortured. And I have this book, Women, Church, and State, which I know was reviewed on WDI, and Bernadette MacDonald brought it to me. And I mean, they're talking about in Bath in 1664 that 6 women were put to death and right in the square, and people were walking by like it was nothing. Well, the torture of women, we have a long history of it. And all of a sudden in the 21st century and in the 20th century, it went quiet. It's like the biggest scam of patriarchy ever, because so much of what happens to women is torture. All of pornography is torture, in my opinion. All of human trafficking pretty well is torture, in my opinion, if you're captive. What is more torturous than captivity? All the strangulation that's going on in so-called sex relationships now between heterosexual young women who tell us about how often strangulation is happening to them without even their consent, which who would ever think you'd consent to strangulation? So I just think that I'm so connected to the witches. And right up to today, the church was the main torturer back then. Now it's more non-state. The patriarch has transformed it into hotel rooms and bedrooms and movie rooms. But we're still being tortured as a gender, as a sex. And it has to stop. So I'm asking women to be brave, and especially feminist women. Who's going to talk about torture if it isn't feminist women? I hear more women that are feminists talk about torture, but I'm asking you to join us and really read our book. If it makes sense to you, use the language so that we can get it named and have it under Article 8, fall under Article 8.
So I'll kind of backtrack. Like Linda said, she called me in the morning and I was so busy writing the book that most of the information that was going on around us, it was kind of secondary to me, because in writing, it's like I need the space to kind of think and I kind of zone out. And Linda tells me, I know you're writing again because I'm kind of zoned out. So that's kind of an ongoing relationship that she and I have, that when I get into writing, I'm in a different space and thinking differently. Anyway, what happened when she came and called me in the morning, and she's telling me what she's just told you, and I'm trying to think, okay, how does our book fit? Do we fit into the Declaration? So what I did, I went into the Declaration and read it, because I really, to be honest, had not been focused. I was focused on the book. So I wasn't focused on the Declaration and what was happening. So as a consequence, as I went through the Declaration, I said to Linda, okay, Article 8, we have to talk about Article 8, how important it is. We really want to go over how important, this is our book. I'll talk very briefly about this. This is why we signed the Declaration. It had to do with our book, like Linda said, and how upset we were. I'm a nurse too, and we knew about puberty blockers and how dangerous that was. But the book is about non-state torture and how silenced women's voices are. Back when Linda said, when we signed the Declaration, we read Article 8 and said, that really fits. And interestingly enough, we just designed this model just like 3 weeks ago, because we were struggling here. There's just the two of us trying to do all this work, and we've never had time to really say, okay, if somebody asked us, what kind of work do we do? How would we explain what we do? We really didn't have a visual image. And we had been attending a webinar on state torture, and they had a model up there, and it made us think, that's very interesting. I wonder if we could take what we've done and put it into a model. And this is the model. And what I'm so thrilled about is that we created the model, and then we looked at Article 8. And we're going to go around Article 8 and the model, just to share with you how proud you should be of how effective Article 8 is, how right on tap you as writers, all the people who wrote it, all the women who were involved, how applicable it is, and how exciting it has been for us to read the writing of Article 8 and apply it here. So we're just going to talk about how it fit for us. And this is why now, 3 years later, we can say it was a wise move for us to sign the Declaration and apply Article 8. So you can see there's like 6 sections. So we're just going to go around and show how they link to each section of Article 8. So the first one around self-assessment and non-state torture and the Universal Questionnaire. Now, the Universal Questionnaire, what that means is that we started our work in 1993. And the first woman was a woman in Nova Scotia. And we both grew up in violence, and we both had sexualized violence victimizations, either as children or young women. So we had a sense of what domestic violence was and what personal victimization was. But when the first woman, she calls herself Sarah, came, she started disclosing forms of violence and human trafficking and so-called human trafficking related to prostitution and pornographic victimization that was beyond our concept. And she started naming it torture. And we looked around, and of course, she was born into a family that started torturing and trafficking her from the time she was born, really. So we started listening and realizing that we were being taken into what we've called a co-culture, because the perpetrators were the neighbor next door, the doctor, the nurse, the social worker, the teacher, the professor, the businessman, the lawyer, the judge, the fisherman. And it was a whole new reality that we had to try to understand the culture of the perpetrators. So when you look at the A of the Article 8, it says you're talking about to recognize those subjected to torture. So this is where this fit. And we said women have the right to name the type of violence that they endured, and we have a responsibility to listen and to work together. So the Universal Questionnaire briefly lists 48 victim-centered statements, how they describe their victimization to us. And we wanted to keep it on one page. So we did. There's 48 forms there. And it's in their language, how they were beaten, how they were kicked savagely, how they were raped, how they were strangled, like Linda mentioned, and choked. So it's all there. So that fit under the A, that of Article 8. The next one, Linda, Linda and I can do the next one around, we had to figure out how to help Sarah and other women that came after her heal, because there was nothing in 1993. There wasn't even a name. There wasn't even acknowledgement that non-state torture happened. And of course, there was no way to find any resources that would help us how to help women heal. And we believed women were healable. If we didn't think they were healable, why would we even start? So that was a fundamental principle. So Linda and I just thought we would give you a couple examples. Linda, do you want to talk about Lynn?
Yeah, so as a nurse, I was a care coordinator. I'm retired now, but back then I was a care coordinator, and this woman had MS, and she was called a difficult client because she was angry and lashing out, and really I figured she was triggered by something. And the VON, the nurses here, wanted to stop looking after her because they didn't want to deal with her responses. So I went and asked her whatever happened to her in her life that would have caused her to act such a way, and she started to unfold all this torture and trafficking that her husband, her legal husband, she was married to him, had subjected her to. And so Jeanne and I started listening to her story, and she was held captive in a windowless room for 4.5 years on a floor and a mattress. And her husband and 3 other men brought men in just constantly to rape and torture her. And she had 5 forced abortions. I mean, she almost died so many times, and then she escaped, and she came back to Truro where we live, and she told the priest, and he told her she was an evil woman and a prostitute and go back to her husband. So she never told another soul till I met her in 25 years later. And once she learned her story and could tell it in a way that she wasn't blaming herself and tell the nurses, they started to care for her with respect, and she died with dignity. So that's the difference. The victimization is she had to tell her own story to understand it for herself and for us to explain it to caregivers. So the trauma-informed care you're always hearing about, and that's just talking about your response, but nobody's letting women talk about the victimization or the crimes, the human rights that they endured, and that's an equally important part. So that's an integral part in our work, the victimization, traumatization, informed care.
That's like the Article 8 number or B section, really. And then we'll move on to the C section, the idea of promoting research and the writing of it and the education of it. So recently, I've been working on an article for Linda and I, and we think it's research that's never been published, never been really done, because we've been doing this for 30 years. So it's a collection of research, predominantly of women. We have a few men that have done some of the questionnaires, but our work has been with women. So I'm on the third writing of it because it just doesn't fit anywhere. And when you're doing feminist research, you get connected to the people, to the women. We have relationships with the women. Even the first woman in 1993, we still have connection with her. And how to get their voices out there. So I'm on the third attempt of writing it, and hopefully to submit it again to another publisher to see if they will take it. But what's really...
We were rejected by the other patriarchal journals. That's the point. As a feminist, try to get your work. They don't want women's voices in research. That's what we've learned.
Trying to get there, or trying to get the images, because if we're listening to women, sometimes what they have to do, they have to draw what happened to them. And what we see in that is, if they were very young when they were victimized, they didn't understand the crime that Linda was talking about, the victimization. They didn't understand what was being done to them. So what we see, if they draw often, then they can do a reflective integration of what was happening. And when they know it's a crime, what we've learned is that gives them space to understand it was not their fault. We were in a webinar once, and a woman said for 30 years she was going to therapy and nobody told her there was a crime that was committed against her. So we know that's important. Anyway, the activism, it takes women's voices, tells us how many have been victimized, how they've been victimized, and to validate what the everyday person thinks, whether there's a distinction between assault, which is what in Canada and what generally law does. They want to say that a woman was assaulted and not tortured, not state tortured. 776 people responded, and we asked them to differentiate with the 48 items on the questionnaire, whether they saw them as torture or assault, if they were being inflicted on one person, either once or many times. And predominantly, there were only 4 out of the 48 that they questioned, and some of it was misunderstanding.
We talked to thousands of women all over the world. And the interesting thing, and also the challenging thing, is since we've been doing it for 30 years, we're still connected to so many. So we're talking to more and more women. It's a lot of talking, it's a lot of networking, but it's very important. And as you know, advocacy is the only way that you get an issue on the table. So we're doing a lot of social justice work at the United Nations. And we've been going to the United Nations for years, since 2004. We're mainly working in Vienna now, but what's going on is we meet these silos that Vienna says they only deal with crime and Geneva says they only deal with human rights, and neither one wants to deal with it. So that's why Reem is so important, because she's kind of broken through those silos and she's listening to us, and we're formulating victim impact statements that we can challenge our own country. And so that takes us into the legal accountability, national and international. Our country of Canada is still resistant to change the criminal code. but we're insistent that it's going to happen. And we feel with the social justice movement from the United Nations, we're also working with the Every Woman Treaty, who have been, we've been co-founders of that since 2014. So we've stayed with it long enough that we've got enough connections. We've got many more lawyers that are supporting us, and we're also involved with Fulfill, which is a group of feminist lawyers that are looking at the human rights of migrant women, and we're on the ethics committee there and are going to educate them about non-state torture more. So, you know, our work is growing. We're very proud of it, and we feel very connected to the Declaration, and 9 too, because they're human rights of children. Because of course, women, most of them were children when the torture started, and they were so confused about themselves that they would be prime targets for anything about trans in school. You know, what their identity is. They're very, you know, why wouldn't you be confused when you're being tortured every day at home? So we're thinking of those children constantly. And it's just so important to be connected to a global movement. And that's why I said thank you to Joe and to Bernadette for keeping the door open to the world, because I go every Saturday and listen and just feel part of a greater movement, because this work for Jeanne and I can be isolating.
I am often angry, and recently we had a mass casualty, like that's under Article 8D. We had a mass casualty commission, and Linda and I were actively engaged. We gave 4 oral statements, made a final presentation, and talked about human evil. And it reminds me of what's going on in the UK and the nurse who killed all the babies. And the parents are talking that they see human evil hidden behind a so-called caring nurse. And of course, that's what non-state torture brought to Linda and I, that we had to address the issue of human evil in our book. So we addressed it in the mass casualty. And when they put out their final report, they totally dismissed saying anything about the women's stories that we said, and asked them to deal with violence against women in all its forms. And that was part of their mandate. And they said that the biggest lesson for them was not to look away, but they totally dismissed non-state torture, victimization of women and children, and did look away. And I'm very angry. So we wrote a final report, and then we wrote to the commissioners and challenged them that they're saying one thing, which is patriarchy and misogyny, but there were 2 women commissioners and 1 male, and challenged them that indeed they didn't do what they said they did. They immediately invisibilized the women who in our province who had endured non-state torture. And that's why I wrote in my statement there, Joe, that I'm angry. I'm still angry. I mean, we get angry every day. But anyway, we'll put the link in there if anybody wants to read what happened, because the reason I bring it up, because the commissioners figured, and the government, it was a national and a provincial report. They figured that it'll be read around the world around mass casualties. And of course, that's a ripple effect that non-state torture is invisible. So it has a global impact when you're ignored and the women are ignored. So thank you.
Linda, you said that when we were talking before this, that you thought that we're at a bit of a tipping point, that you're I think both Jeanne and Linda said your houses are very, very messy and you just don't have time to have meals sometimes because you're so busy, but you feel that there's, well, certainly Linda, you said that you feel there's a bit of a tipping point at the moment. What did you mean by that?
Well, I just think that the world is in such chaos. I think with the backlash, the huge backlash against women and COVID and climate crisis, I think that we're in another 30-year transformational point. And I think that for women, it's a tipping point because we wouldn't have a backlash if we hadn't been so successful in getting women on the table. So if we can, you know, just keep keep steady and keep pushing against the backlash. And that's what we're doing. Everyone that's here today, we're talking about the human rights of women. We're not going to be invisibilized. I think that we will succeed. I really believe that. And of course, we know in crisis, the success happens on the event horizon, and all those who have worked hard to get all their theory and practice in order, they're the ones that can hop in when the world kind of collapses. And that's where I feel any of us transformers, and I think Jeanne and I are a part of that, that our work will fit in. And I'm already seeing that. I'm already seeing that happen with our work, that structures are kind of starting to look for something that fits, and our work is starting to fit in ways that never did before. So I believe, and I've seen that, I believe that all along, or I wouldn't have started it. So I feel it's coming now, and I'm thankful we're ready. That's what I feel, ready.
And another question I have is about young women who are these days subjected to more and more violence and torture in their relationships. They're just sort of starting out in life, and if they get a boyfriend, then they suddenly, you know, they'll do something, have something done to them by this aggressive, violent man, young man. Have you found that you can reach young women with your work, and that more young women are reaching out to you?
The interesting thing, Linda and I were on a private meeting actually with young women, and of course we've been around for quite a long time, and it was rather shocking, I have to say, that they couldn't distinguish between what love and caring and, I guess, respectful sexual behavior and violence was. I mean, it was a shocking surprise, because some of them said in their sexual relationships, they were being beaten and kicked and strangled and choked, and they didn't know the difference. Now, Linda and I, around the young people, we've educated young people, like that's grade 7 and high school, and they want to talk. They want to talk and have clarity. And we found that especially the young men get confused, because the so-called issue of sex work and gender and all of that new ideology, I guess you'd have to say, so-called, is confusing them. Yes, I think we're not having enough conversation.
Mothers tell us that they give our book to their teenage daughters and they just lap it up. So that's exciting. Yeah. And you know, we have young men. There's a playwright that's wants to do a play on our work, and she's working with a young man who's a graphic artist, and he's really excited to be part of it, because young men don't want this either. No, lots of young men are indoctrinated, but there's a population of young men that are starving for healthy conversation. But I think what struck me the most, you know, we see all this kink and BDSM, is that young woman said to us, she thought that she was a heterosexual woman. She thought that sex always had to be painful. That was her. Wow. I'm like, okay, this is bad.
What is the difference between state torture and non-state torture? Just, I think it's good to sort of reiterate that.
So state torture is torture that is supported and ordered by the state. So it would be military, prisoner of war, what happens in embassies, police stations. Non-state torture is torture that happens by the everyday person, that is not endorsed by the state, not known by the state, in the sense of that they don't know that so-and-so's father is torturing the little girl at night in the torture room in the basement. So it's done by parents, human traffickers, prostituters, pornographers, or organized crime gangs. It's FGM. It's all of those everyday kinds of torture. And there's much more non-state torture than there is state torture. That's the thing. The state gets the prevalence because it's patriarchal, and patriarchy wants to invisibilize the non-state torture because it only happens to women and girls. You know, so it's not as important. Jeanne and I are in the battle now, trying to get adult entertainment out of the bylaws in our community. And in their description of adult entertainment, they even have the word designed to exploit the sexual aspects. So that's even right in their document in the town. And then the bottom of the little fact, they have a picture of a nude woman. You know, so the misogyny is right out there, and we're getting resistance from the men planners saying that the bylaw is there to prevent anybody from coming in, and they're making it so hard to put it in. So, you know, this patriarchy is always surprising, and we probably will lose. But as we know, strip clubs are an entry point to human trafficking and to torture, and that's our argument. But the battle continues, and I'm going to keep it up. I won't speak for Jeanne. I'm keeping it up till I take my last breath.